The summer sun hung high over the Arizona desert, relentless and golden, stretching shadows across the rugged terrain like slow-moving tides. Jake Callahan rode along the southern ridge of his ranch, a lone figure against the endless expanse of red sandstone and dry scrub. The wind carried the faint scent of sage and dust, brushing against his sun-worn face. His horse, Dust, moved with a steady rhythm over the uneven ground, hooves kicking up small clouds of sand. Jake's life had been one of quiet routine for years. Ever since the fire, every day followed the same pattern: rise with the sun, feed the horses, check the fences, ride the land, and repair whatever needed repair. At night, he'd sit on the porch with a mug of strong coffee, watching the sun pour itself into the horizon, painting the desert in reds and oranges. The land didn't ask questions, and the cattle didn't demand attention beyond the daily chores. It was a life of predictability, and Jake had learned to find comfort in its solitude. But that August morning, the wind carried something different, a sound so faint it might have been ignored. At first, he thought it was a coyote or a trapped rabbit, its whimpers echoing across the canyon. Yet as he paused, narrowing his eyes, he recognized it for what it truly was: a woman's voice, weak and strained, carried by the heat-dulled air. He guided Dust carefully into the canyon brush, the mesquite and sage forming dense walls around him. The wind whispered through the branches, and the sun cast sharp shadows over the dusty ground. Then he saw her, a figure lying beneath a wide, twisted mesquite tree. She was on her side, one ankle twisted beneath her, clothes torn and dusty, and her dark hair tangled with leaves and small twigs. Her eyes, wide and frightened, met his. Time seemed to freeze. For a moment, there was no wind, no sun, no desert, just the two of them, suspended in that fragile balance between danger and rescue. Jake dismounted slowly, hands raised to show he meant no harm. "You okay?" he asked, his voice low, rough with disuse. She didn't answer, only shivered faintly, her breath ragged. He knelt beside her, reaching for his canteen. After a hesitant pause, she drank, lips trembling against the metal. Her skin was warm under his fingers, flushed with fever and exertion. "Can you stand?" he asked. She tried, and a sharp hiss of pain cut the air. Her ankle was badly swollen, twisted at a cruel angle. Jake didn't press further. Instead, he lifted her carefully, his hand strong and sure from years of wrangling horses and cattle. With patient movements, he secured her across Dust's back and walked alongside them through the canyon floor. The ride back to the cabin was slow. The sun climbed, blazing against the red rocks and scrub, and Jake's senses remained alert. Each shift of the horse, each rustle of brush, drew his attention. He had lived too long in silence to ignore the faintest hint of danger. When they reached the cabin, Jake set her gently on the old couch. The weight of her small frame was light, but the reality of her presence hit him. She was alive, and fragile, and dependent on him in this moment. He unpacked his small medical supplies, cloths, and herbal salve. Though he wasn't a doctor, he knew enough to clean wounds and set sprains. Hours passed in quiet labor. She flinched at first, then slowly relaxed, watching him with dark, cautious eyes. He didn't push her to speak, her silence was a choice he respected. Outside, the wind carried the cries of distant birds, the soft rustle of leaves, and the occasional sigh of cattle settling in the shade. That evening, she finally spoke. "My name is Ayanna," she said softly, her voice low and careful, as though words themselves might betray her. "I'm Jake," he replied, nodding. That simple exchange felt like a bridge, a tentative thread connecting them. Over the next several days, Ayanna began to regain her strength. Her ankle remained tender, but she moved with increasing confidence around the cabin. She helped with small chores, prepared meals with herbs she foraged, and cleaned with careful attention. Jake watched her quietly, noting the grace with which she moved, the intelligence in her eyes, and the way she seemed to understand the desert in ways he had long taken for granted. She didn't speak of the men who had chased her, but the story revealed itself in fragments. She was Apache, from a village deep in the canyon. Strangers with rifles had come to her home, and she had fled during the night. Her journey through the desert had been long and treacherous. The land had almost claimed her before Jake had found her. Jake never asked for details. He sensed that she would share when she was ready, and he respected that. Instead, he focused on her recovery and the rhythm of their days together. The silence between them, once empty, began to fill with unspoken understanding. One morning, Jake noticed footprints near the north fence, heavy, deep, deliberate. They weren't his. He crouched, inspecting the tracks, boots of men accustomed to tracking, moving with purpose. His pulse tightened. Someone was searching, someone dangerous. That evening, he loaded his rifle and kept it beside the door, eyes scanning the horizon. Ayanna, sitting on the porch with a blanket draped over her shoulders, glanced at the rifle. "You saw them," she said softly. "They're close," Jake replied, his voice low, steady. "They will come," she said, gazing across the desert. "They always do." Jake's chest tightened. This was no longer about the land alone, it was about her. Someone he cared for, someone he was responsible for. The following days passed in tense vigilance. Jake rode the boundaries of the ranch, scouting for tracks. Each discovery, scattered footprints, broken branches, distant shadows, heightened his alertness. Ayanna stayed mostly in the cabin, tending to minor chores, foraging for herbs, and learning to move carefully around the land. Yet she was far from helpless. She observed, listened, and adapted. One evening, the tension broke, if only slightly. The sun sank low, painting the canyon walls in molten gold. Ayanna brought a small meal of roasted roots and herbs to the porch. She sat beside Jake, offering him a piece of bread. He accepted, and for the first time in days, neither spoke of danger, only of the land, the desert, and the wind. "I never thought I'd see another sunrise like this," she said quietly, her dark eyes reflecting the fading light. Jake's gaze lingered on her. "You're safe here," he said. "For now." She didn't answer immediately, only leaned slightly against him, a gesture of trust, fragile but real. The next week brought trials beyond mere men. Summer storms rolled in with sudden intensity, thunder echoing off the canyon walls, lightning sparking across the dry air. Dust turned to mud in pockets, small gullies filled with swift water, and the heat pressed relentlessly. Jake and Ayanna navigated these challenges together, hauling supplies, securing the cabin, and tending to the animals. Through it all, a quiet partnership formed, a bond forged in necessity, trust, and shared solitude. When the storm passed, the land seemed to sigh in relief. Jake and Ayanna stepped outside together, surveying the canyon in the post-storm light. The desert smelled of wet sage and sun-warmed earth. For a moment, all the fear, all the past, seemed distant. But danger was never far. Tracks appeared again, this time near the ridge, unmistakable and threatening. Jake's hand rested on his rifle, muscles tense. He did not fear death for himself, he feared losing her, losing what little fragile life had returned to him. When the men finally arrived, they rode slow, their dust-coated horses leaving trails of menace. For in number, with hard eyes and weapons ready, they bore the aura of mercenaries accustomed to fear and payment. The scarred man at their head demanded Ayanna's surrender, citing papers and orders. Jake's calm, firm refusal created a tense standoff. Ayanna stepped forward, small but unshakable, her voice carrying across the canyon. "I will not go," she said, eyes blazing with defiance. Jake moved instinctively, rifle steady. "She stays," he growled, the weight of years and the desert behind him. The standoff ended without bloodshed, the men retreating, unwilling to risk their lives. Jake lowered his rifle, hands trembling slightly, and Ayanna's tears streaked the dust from her cheeks. Words were unnecessary, their silence held gratitude, relief, and something deeper. That evening, on the porch, they watched the sun fade into the canyon. Weeks passed. Ayana's ankle healed. Her presence became part of the land's rhythm. She planted herbs, taught Jake to read the stars, and listen to the desert. He taught her ranching skills, survival, and marksmanship. Love grew in gestures, silences, and shared work. The days stretched long and dry, the desert sun relentless, yet somehow softer in the mornings and evenings, when light painted the canyon walls in colors that defied the barren terrain. Jake found himself watching Ayana more often than he had intended. She moved with a quiet confidence now, tending to small gardens she had planted behind the cabin, her fingers brushing over the sprigs of desert sage, thyme, and prickly pear. She hummed low, almost inaudibly, a melody of her own making, and the sound carried faintly on the wind, threading through the canyons and settling into the hollows of his heart. Jake returned to his routine, but now, his tasks were shared. She fetched water from the nearby creek, her steps light and careful, learning to navigate the uneven banks. She helped mend fences with him, holding boards steady, hammering nails with precision that impressed him. Her hands were small, but she worked with a strength born of necessity. In turn, Jake taught her how to ride dust properly, how to judge the mood of the animals, and how to anticipate the sudden movements of cattle or wild creatures. They spoke little, their words sparse but weighty. Even in silence, there was conversation, the brush of hands when passing tools, the shared laughter when a horse stubbornly refused a command, the way their eyes met over the rim of a water trough. The quiet companionship grew, subtle yet unmistakable. One evening, after the sun had melted into the horizon, Jake led Ayana to the ridge overlooking the canyon. The air was cooler here, a faint breeze carrying the scent of dust and sage. He gestured for her to sit on a flat rock, and together, they watched the shadows stretch across the valley floor. "You've learned the land quickly," he said, his voice low. She smiled faintly, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "It teaches you if you listen." Jake nodded, surprised by the insight. She had been through more in a few short weeks than most endured in a lifetime, and yet, she adapted. Resilience clung to her like the sun to the desert stones. Days later, the tracks appeared again, deeper and more numerous this time, marking the passage of men intent on following her trail. Jake studied them carefully, tracing the impressions with his boot, noting the spacing and depth. These were not ordinary ranchers, not casual passers-by. They moved with purpose, armed and patient, the kind of hunters who would not give up easily. "I'll ride the perimeter tomorrow," he told her, loading his rifle in the early morning light. Ayana nodded, but there was a shadow of worry in her eyes. "Be careful," she said softly. "I always am," he replied, though the truth weighed heavier than his words suggested. The next day, Jake rode the outer ridges, dust moving steadily over the sun-baked earth. From high points, he could see the glimmer of metal in the distance, flashes of dust trails that suggested horses moving methodically. His pulse quickened, but he forced himself to remain calm, noting landmarks and alternate routes should the men try to approach undetected. By mid-morning, he discovered broken branches, signs of recent passage, and a small camp where someone had rested. The desert was ruthless, leaving traces of life behind as if marking the path of survival. Jake's mind catalogued everything: the direction of the wind, the dryness of the soil, the faint scent of smoke lingering near a rock outcrop. Whoever they were close. Returning to the cabin, he found Ayana arranging herbs in small bundles, her fingers deftly tying sage and mesquite into neat bunches. She looked up when he entered, her dark eyes calm despite the tension he carried. "They're getting closer," he said quietly, not wanting to startle her. She nodded, her expression unreadable. "We prepare, we do not panic." Jake admired her restraint. Where fear could paralyze, she chose action, even with her ankle still tender. Together, they reinforced the cabin doors, secured the windows, and stashed water and food in hidden locations. Every detail mattered. Every precaution could be the difference between safety and disaster. During the heat of the day, they would retreat to the shade of the cabin, sipping water and resting. Ayanna taught Jake about the desert herbs she used for teas, for healing, and for flavoring simple meals. He listened attentively, fascinated by the depth of her knowledge, which seemed as natural as the desert itself. She spoke little of her past, but enough to understand her courage, her survival instincts, and her sharp mind. Evenings became their sanctuary. On the porch, they shared small conversations, the vast sky overhead turning from gold to pink, then deep violet. Ayanna would lean against Jake's shoulder sometimes, her weight slight but comforting, and he found himself bracing less for the desert and more for the moments she shared with him. One night, the moon rose full and luminous, casting a silver glow over the red rocks. Ayanna brought a blanket to the porch and draped it around both of them. Jake felt the warmth against his side, the subtle pressure of her leaning in. The desert was quiet, save for the occasional hoot of an owl or the rustle of a nocturnal creature. "I haven't slept properly in a long time," she admitted, voice soft. Jake looked at her. "I didn't know you'd find rest here." "I didn't know I could," she said, eyes reflecting moonlight. "Not until now." They stayed like that, wrapped in the blanket, sharing the silence and the unspoken bond forming between them. Days turned into weeks. Jake and Ayanna learned to predict the desert storms, the sudden shifts in temperature, the habits of the wildlife. They discovered hidden springs, learned which plants could be eaten or brewed for medicine, and identified landmarks that could serve as warnings or navigation points. The land itself became a teacher, and they learned together, building a rhythm that was both practical and intimate. One afternoon, a sudden dust cloud rose on the far ridge. Jake spotted it first, his instincts honed from years on the ranch. He motioned for Ayanna to stay inside, his hand resting on the rifle. The cloud drew closer, revealing 4 riders, hats low and guns ready. The scarred man at their head dismounted first, demanding the girl's surrender. Jake stood tall, his rifle in hand, his stance firm. "She stays," he said, voice unwavering. Ayanna appeared at the doorway, limping slightly but steady. "I will not go," she declared, eyes fierce with defiance. The standoff was tense. Dust swirled around boots and hooves. The men weighed their odds. Jake's resolve, combined with Ayanna's courage, made retreat the safer option. Slowly, the mercenaries withdrew, leaving only a trail of dust and the faint smell of sweat and leather behind. Afterward, Jake lowered his rifle, hands trembling slightly. Ayanna's tears streaked away the dust from her cheeks, but her smile was small, resolute. Words were unnecessary, they had survived, together. In the days that followed, they explored more of the canyon, mapping safe routes and hidden clearings. They encountered desert wildlife, rattlesnakes, jackrabbits, coyotes, but none threatened them, not when they moved with careful awareness. Each day brought small victories, a repaired fence, a successfully tended garden, a shared meal prepared from foraged herbs. Their bond deepened quietly. Jake began to notice the way Ayanna's eyes caught the light of the sunset, the curve of her hand when she worked, the subtle strength in her voice when she spoke. She, in turn, learned to read the subtle cues in his posture, the way he approached challenges, and the faint traces of emotion that surfaced despite his stoicism. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the stars, Ayanna asked, "Do you ever think about what life would have been like if things were different?" Jake considered the question carefully, his gaze on the horizon. "Sometimes," he admitted. "But if it were different, I wouldn't have met you." Her lips curved in a faint smile. "Then maybe it's better this way." Weeks passed, and the ranch became not only a home but a sanctuary. The desert that had once seemed empty and harsh now felt alive with possibility. Jake and Ayanna found peace in their shared routines, trust in each other's presence, and even moments of quiet laughter that echoed across the canyon walls. Rumors began to circulate in the nearest town about the Apache woman living with the quiet cowboy. Some whispered suspicion, others admiration, but no one dared challenge the life that had taken root in that canyon. The legend grew slowly, a story of resilience, courage, and the improbable bond between two people shaped by loss, survival, and the desert itself. The days grew hotter, the sun pressing down on the red stones and sagebrush until the very air seemed to shimmer. Jake had learned to rise before dawn, when the world was still cool and silent, and to make the most of those early hours. Dust stirred lazily as he fed the horses, water sloshing in the trough, the faint bray of a distant mule echoing through the canyon. Ayanna, moving with careful balance, joined him at the trough, her bare feet steady on the warm earth. "Careful of the thorns," Jake said, nodding toward a cluster of mesquite. "I am careful," she replied, though the faint smirk tugging at her lips suggested she knew he worried more than necessary. Their mornings became a dance of silent coordination. Jake would saddle Dust while Ayanna checked the fences, then they would ride the land together, surveying cattle and crops, listening to the wind for signs of trouble. Even the smallest details mattered: a missing calf, the faint scrape of a hoof in sand, a twig broken at the wrong angle. The desert demanded awareness, and they had learned to move as one, attuned to each other's instincts. By late morning, the sun reached its peak. Dust and the other horses sought shade, their flanks glistening with sweat. Jake and Ayanna would retreat to the cabin, where she would prepare tea from sage or chamomile, the aroma filling the small, rough-hewn space. They ate lightly, their conversation sparse but meaningful. One day, while repairing a section of fence near the creek, Ayanna stumbled slightly over a hidden rock. Jake caught her quickly, steadying her with a firm grip. Their eyes met, and for a moment, the desert, the sun, the dust, all of it, disappeared. "You're strong," he said quietly. "So are you," she replied, a faint blush warming her cheeks. She wrenched her hand free and continued her work, though the spark in her eyes lingered. Evening brought a different rhythm. The sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the canyon. The air cooled, carrying the scent of drying earth and desert blooms. Ayanna would often sit on the porch, her feet bare against the wood, and Jake would join her. Sometimes they simply watched the horizon, listening to the distant cry of a hawk or the faint rustle of the desert brush. Other times, they spoke of the past, careful fragments of stories, memories, losses, and fears. One night, under a sky filled with stars, Ayanna leaned against Jake's shoulder. "I think I've learned more about survival here than I ever could have in my village," she said softly. "And I've learned more about life than I thought I would," Jake replied, his voice low, almost reverent. He didn't elaborate, words were unnecessary. The silence between them was filled with trust, warmth, and something far deeper, something both terrifying and exhilarating. But even in these quiet moments, danger lingered. Tracks continued to appear along the ridges and canyon trails, sometimes fresh, sometimes older but unmistakably human. Jake studied them diligently, tracing their patterns, noting the timing. Whoever pursued Ayanna was persistent and cunning. They were closing in. One afternoon, a dust storm erupted without warning. The sky darkened, and the wind howled through the canyon with furious intensity. Jake and Ayanna worked together, securing the cabin and sheltering the animals. Dust whirled into their eyes and hair, sand scraping against skin, and the canyon seemed to close in around them. Inside the cabin, Ayanna lit a small fire, the smoke curling through the cracks in the roof. Jake sat across from her, cleaning his rifle and checking ammunition. Their eyes met across the room, and neither spoke for several minutes, each aware of the fragile thread of life connecting them. When the storm subsided, the canyon floor was littered with debris, twisted branches, upturned rocks, and the faint marks of horses and men moving through the mess. Jake traced the paths carefully, noting new tracks. The men were close now, perhaps only hours away. That night, they sat on the porch once more, the desert quiet except for the faint murmur of distant water. Ayanna reached for his hand, intertwining fingers. "If they come," she whispered, "we fight, we survive." Jake nodded, squeezing her hand. "We do," he said. "Together. Weeks passed in tense vigilance. Every day brought new challenges: scorching sun, sudden rain, stubborn cattle, and the constant awareness of unseen eyes tracking their every move. Yet through it all, Jake and Ayanna learned to anticipate each other's needs, to move as a unit, to trust without question. Their bond grew, quiet and steady, like water carving a canyon through stone. Occasionally, they ventured to the nearby town for supplies. Jake kept his hat low, his voice subdued, while Ayanna moved quietly beside him, her presence both unnoticed and quietly magnetic. Townsfolk whispered about the Apache woman living with the solitary cowboy, some with suspicion, others with admiration. But Jake's reputation preceded him, his skill with horses, his unyielding nature, and now the quiet strength he shared with Ayanna. No one dared challenge him. One evening, as they returned from the town, a pair of riders appeared on a distant ridge. Dust rose in faint plumes, the horses moving with precision and intent. Jake's pulse quickened, but he remained calm, signaling Ayanna to stay close. The men were scouts, perhaps mercenaries, testing the boundaries, searching for weaknesses. They watched from the ridge, observing, waiting. Jake calculated their likely path, their potential approach, and how best to protect the cabin. "They're testing us," he murmured. "They will find nothing," Ayanna replied, her dark eyes fierce. "We are ready." Together, they prepared, reinforcing doors, securing windows, and creating false paths to confuse any pursuers. The desert became both shield and weapon, every rock and ridge a potential vantage point. One night, as the moon rose silver over the canyon, Jake and Ayanna sat by a small fire outside the cabin. The air was cooler now, carrying the scent of sage and wet earth from a recent rain. Ayanna leaned against him, her head resting lightly on his shoulder. "I never thought I'd find a place to rest," she whispered. "And I never thought I'd want someone beside me," Jake admitted, voice low and steady. Her eyes met his, dark and wide, reflecting the firelight. For a moment, time itself seemed to pause. The desert around them was silent, the stars watching. Then, slowly, they leaned closer, the first brush of lips tentative, careful, yet filled with the weight of months of shared trials and quiet yearning. The kiss ended as the wind shifted, stirring the fire and ruffling their hair, reminding them that the world outside their little sanctuary remained unpredictable, dangerous, and alive. The next days were filled with a mixture of work, study, and preparation. Jake and Ayanna became inseparable, moving in rhythm with each other, reading the signs of the land, predicting storms, and anticipating the approach of any threats. They mapped the canyon, creating hidden paths, and established safe zones for cattle, horses, and themselves. Rumors of their presence in the nearby town grew. Some spoke in hushed tones about the Apache woman living with the quiet cowboy, while others spread stories of her courage and wisdom. Jake paid little attention, the land itself was enough protection. But Ayanna listened carefully, noting the attitudes of people, the patterns of suspicion and admiration, and the subtle undercurrents of human behavior. As summer deepened, the desert presented its final test. A wildfire sparked on the far ridge, smoke curling high into the sky. Jake and Ayanna worked tirelessly, moving animals, clearing brush, and monitoring the spread. The fire roared, consuming everything in its path, and for the first time, the solitude of their life was replaced with urgency and danger. They fought the fire side by side, learning to rely on each other more than ever. Exhausted, covered in ash and sweat, they finally watched the last flames die down as night fell. The desert, scarred but alive, seemed to acknowledge their survival, the stars above shimmering in silent approval. In the quiet aftermath, they found themselves on the porch once more, sitting close, hands intertwined. The shared trials had forged an unspoken promise between them: survival, trust, and the bond of two hearts intertwined in the harsh, beautiful desert. The desert seemed endless, stretching in every direction with relentless sun during the day and chilling cold at night. Jake could feel the weight of the days pressing down on him, the constant vigilance, the knowledge that danger was out there somewhere, always watching. Ayana moved with quiet efficiency beside him, her ankle now mostly healed, her dark eyes scanning the horizon as she carried water or prepared herbs. They had grown attuned to the subtle signs of the desert. A shift in the wind could indicate the approach of animals, or men. The way the light fell across rocks in the late afternoon could hide a horse or a scout. And Jake had taught Ayana to read these signs with the same patience and precision he had developed over years of solitary life. One morning, a faint cloud of dust on the northern ridge caught his eye. He narrowed his vision, following it with practiced focus. For riders, moving slowly but deliberately, the unmistakable cadence of horses carrying men accustomed to pursuit. Jake's jaw tightened. They were back, and this time, they were closer than before. Ayana emerged from the cabin, carrying a small bundle of herbs. She paused when she saw the dust plume, her eyes immediately finding the danger. "They have come," she said softly. Jake nodded, scanning the terrain. "We'll use the canyon paths. They'll expect the open trail, not the narrow winding ridges." He gestured for her to follow. Together, they mounted Dust and two of the ranch horses, moving silently toward the protective cover of a steep gorge. The riders had not yet seen them. From the ridge, they appeared as shadows against the sun-baked stone, their wide-brimmed hats low, guns glinting. Jake led Ayana into the winding gorge, a path few knew, the walls rising high on either side, offering concealment and tactical advantage. Dust moved easily, hooves clicking against the rocky terrain, muscles coiled and ready. Hours passed with tense silence, each step calculated, each glance toward the ridge. They stopped at a narrow ledge where a spring trickled from a hidden crevice. Ayana dismounted, her fingers brushing over the water as she drank, while Jake scanned the ridge above, listening for any sign of pursuit. The men had not found them yet, but Jake knew it was only a matter of time. "Do you think they'll follow?" Ayana asked, her voice low, eyes wary. "They always do," Jake replied. "But they don't know this land like we do." As the sun dipped, the temperature dropped sharply. They made camp beneath the overhang of the gorge, creating a small fire for warmth and cooking. Ayana moved with calm precision, arranging herbs and food, while Jake cleaned his rifles and checked ammunition. Their movements were synchronized, a rhythm born of shared necessity and trust. Night fell, and with it came the distant sounds of men moving across the desert. Jake listened carefully, mapping their likely path. They were cautious, testing the land, seeking signs of movement. But Jake and Ayana had the advantage of knowledge, concealment, and patience. "We need to be ready," Jake said, eyes scanning the stars and the shadows beyond the gorge. "I am ready," Ayana replied, her voice steady. She leaned against him briefly, and he felt the familiar warmth of her presence, the quiet reassurance that they were not alone. The next morning, they moved again, skirting the ridge and using every natural feature as cover. They found an abandoned prospector's cabin, a place hidden from the main trail, with a dry creek nearby and rocks forming natural barricades. They made this their temporary stronghold, reinforcing the doors and setting discreet traps around the perimeter. Jake taught Ayana how to create simple alarms using string and tin, how to hide their tracks, and how to use the land to their advantage. Even with the tension, moments of quiet intimacy returned. Ayana would braid her hair carefully, humming low, and Jake found himself drawn to the rhythm, the ordinary act made extraordinary by their shared isolation. Sometimes, they would lie beneath the stars, hands intertwined, sharing soft whispers of past lives and future dreams. The desert, harsh and unyielding, became a sanctuary, a place where trust and love could grow quietly, defiantly, in the face of constant threat. But danger remained ever present. One afternoon, as they scouted the surrounding ridges, the distant gleam of metal caught Jake's eye. For riders, approaching from the north, moving faster this time, urgency in every line of their posture. Jake's heart raced, but he forced calm. "We'll make our stand here," he said. This ridge gives us the advantage. Ayanna nodded, retrieving her small hunting knife and adjusting her pack. She met his eyes, dark and resolute. Together, she said. The riders came into view, dust trailing behind them, guns ready. Jake and Ayanna crouched behind a rock outcrop, surveying the approach. The men were seasoned, confident, but unprepared for the narrow path Jake had chosen. When they reached the base of the ridge, Jake fired a warning shot, the echo bouncing across the canyon. Dust rose, and the riders froze, reassessing. "They're here," the scarred man shouted, scanning the ridge. "Come down, girl, and no one gets hurt." Ayanna stepped forward slightly, her dark hair whipping in the wind. "I am not going anywhere," she said firmly. The standoff was tense, every second stretching. Jake's fingers hovered over his rifle, ready, his eyes scanning for openings. The other men dismounted, guns raised, moving cautiously, unaware of the traps Jake and Ayanna had set along the path. Suddenly, a rock shifted underfoot, a calculated distraction, and a small tin clattered against the stone, startling the riders. Dust swirled, the men cursed, and Jake fired another shot, this one precise, aimed to warn rather than kill. The horse nearest the riders bolted slightly, chaos rippling through their ranks. Ayanna moved with quick precision, retrieving a small pouch of dirt and sand, throwing it toward the men's eyes as they recovered. The delay gave Jake the chance to reposition, his rifle steady, his aim unwavering. "Leave now, or face the consequences," he growled. The scarred man paused, calculating. The odds were against them, this narrow ridge, the traps, the desert itself working as an ally for Jake and Ayanna. Finally, he spat to the side, muttering curses, and signaled the retreat. The other men hesitated, glancing at him, then followed. Dust trailed behind them, marking their departure like a fading storm. Jake exhaled, lowering his rifle. His hands were trembling slightly, adrenaline coursing through his veins. Ayanna stepped beside him, eyes shining with quiet pride. "We did it," she said softly. "Yes," he replied, voice hoarse. "We survived." They remained on the ridge until the sun dipped below the horizon, ensuring the men had retreated fully. As darkness fell, they returned to the cabin, hands intertwined, moving with a renewed sense of purpose. That night, they lay beneath the stars once more, sharing warmth, trust, and a quiet acknowledgement of their feelings. "You know," Ayanna whispered, her fingers tracing the scars on Jake's hand, "I never imagined I could feel safe again." "You're safe," he replied, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "And I'm not letting anyone take that from you." Their bond deepened, the unspoken promise between them growing stronger. Days became weeks, and while the desert remained harsh and unforgiving, it also offered beauty, the bloom of desert flowers after a rare rain, the haunting cries of distant coyotes, the endless expanse of stars at night. Jake and Ayanna learned to thrive within the desert's rhythm. They planted additional herbs and small crops behind the cabin, built a hidden shelter for emergencies, and created signaling methods in case danger approached again. Every task, every shared moment, strengthened the trust and intimacy between them. One evening, as the sun sank low, painting the canyon in reds and golds, Ayanna turned to Jake. "Do you ever regret the life you lived before I came?" Jake paused, considering. "No," he said finally. "Because if I hadn't lived it, I wouldn't have found you." Ayanna's eyes glimmered in the fading light, and she leaned into him, resting her head on his shoulder. "Then maybe the desert isn't as cruel as it seems," she murmured. Jake smiled faintly, the weight of years and loss lifting slightly. "Maybe not," he agreed, watching the shadows stretch across the canyon floor. The days stretched long under the relentless sun. Jake and Ayanna had settled into a rhythm that was both familiar and tense, a rhythm of work, vigilance, and quiet intimacy. The desert, for all its harshness, had become their refuge, a place where danger existed, yes, but where trust and reliance on each other could flourish. One morning, as the golden light of dawn touched the canyon ridges, Jake noticed something odd near the creek where they watered the horses. A faint glimmer of metal caught the sun, a trap or sign left by those who had been following them. He crouched, inspecting it carefully, a thin wire stretched between two rocks, nearly invisible. It was designed to trip the unwary, to unseat a horse or injure a pursuer. "They're getting closer," he said quietly to Ayanna as she approached with a basket of herbs. Her eyes scanned the surrounding cliffs, dark and sharp. "They always do," she replied. "But we're ready." Jake nodded, appreciating her calmness. Together, they removed the trap and reset it for their own use, creating a defensive perimeter around the creek. The desert was unforgiving, but they had learned to use its harshness as their advantage. Life continued with long rides and routine chores, but the shadow of pursuit lingered. When they ventured to town for supplies, Jake kept his hat low, voice subdued, and Ayanna stayed close, moving with quiet assurance. Townsfolk had grown accustomed to their presence. Whispers followed them, stories of the Apache woman and the solitary cowboy spreading in hushed tones. Some feared them, some admired them, but none dared interfere. One evening, while returning from town, a storm rolled across the horizon. Lightning illuminated the desert in brief, brilliant flashes, and thunder rumbled through the canyons like a distant drum. They quickened their pace, racing against the approaching tempest. Dust and wind whipped around them, rain beginning to sting their faces. "Let's make it to the cabin before it hits," Jake shouted over the wind. Ayanna's eyes were fierce, dark and determined, as she urged her horse forward. They reached the cabin just as the storm struck, rain lashing the walls, wind rattling the shutters. Inside, they huddled near the fire, soaking wet but safe. Ayanna moved with quick efficiency, tending to the horses and drying what supplies they could. Jake, watching her, felt an ache in his chest, a mixture of admiration and longing. The storm passed as suddenly as it had arrived, leaving the desert glistening, the air cool and heavy with the scent of wet earth. Outside, the tracks of animals and men alike were clearly visible in the softened soil. Jake traced them carefully, noting the approach of more riders, likely scouts for the group that had been pursuing Ayanna. "They've come again," he said, voice low. Ayanna's eyes darkened. "Then we do what we must." For the next several days, Jake and Ayanna prepared meticulously. They mapped the canyon, marking hidden paths and escape routes, and created additional traps and signaling methods. The desert itself became both shield and weapon, every ridge, rock, and hidden hollow serving a purpose. They moved with silent precision, attuned to each other's movements, each instinct honed by necessity and trust. During these tense days, their bond deepened further. Moments of tenderness were rare but precious, a hand brushed against another while securing a gate, a shared glance across the canyon, a whispered word in the night. The desert, vast and unyielding, seemed to shrink around them in these moments, creating a world of their own. One evening, while resting near a hidden spring, Ayanna leaned against Jake's shoulder. "I never imagined I could feel safe again," she murmured. "You are safe," he replied, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "And I won't let anyone take that from you." Her eyes, dark and shining, met his, and a faint smile curved her lips. They sat in silence, the desert around them alive with the quiet rustle of leaves, distant calls of coyotes, and the gentle ripple of water. Days later, Jake discovered fresh tracks near the northern ridge. The pursuers were relentless, testing every approach, probing for weaknesses. He studied the tracks carefully, noting the timing and spacing of horses, the size of boots, and the direction of movement. "They're organized," he said to Ayanna. "And they're getting bolder." "They always do," she replied calmly. "But we are ready." They decided to use the natural features of the land to their advantage. Narrow canyons, steep ridges, and hidden overhangs provided cover, while the desert's harshness would slow any pursuers. They set traps strategically, using small boulders, tripwires, and decoy tracks to confuse and mislead. One afternoon, a small group of riders approached the hidden spring. Jake and Ayanna lay in wait, hearts steady, rifles ready. The riders moved cautiously, scanning the terrain. When they reached the spring, Jake fired a warning shot, the echo bouncing through the canyon. Dust erupted, and the riders froze. "They're here," the scarred man shouted, stepping forward. Ayanna stepped from her hiding place, dark hair whipping in the wind, eyes fierce. "I am not going anywhere," she declared. Jake moved beside her, rifle raised, ready to defend. The other men dismounted, guns drawn, but the narrow terrain gave Jake and Ayanna the advantage. Every movement was deliberate, every shot calculated to warn, not kill, though both were prepared if necessary. The confrontation was tense, the desert silent except for the rustle of horses and the occasional shot. The pursuers realized quickly that Jake and Ayanna knew the land intimately, and any attempt to rush would be met with precise resistance. After hours of maneuvering, confusion, and strategic displays of force, the riders finally retreated, dust trailing behind them like a fading storm. Jake and Ayanna exhaled, lowering their weapons. The desert was calm once more, the stars bright above, as if acknowledging their survival. They returned to the cabin, hands intertwined, moving with a renewed sense of purpose and intimacy. In the weeks that followed, life at the ranch found a fragile normalcy. The desert remained a place of work, vigilance, and quiet beauty. Ayanna tended to herbs and small crops, Jake repaired fences and managed the cattle, and together they explored hidden springs, shaded canyons, and distant ridges. Their bond grew deeper, the quiet moments of trust and intimacy as important as the daily routines. They spoke rarely of love, but it was present in every gesture, the way Jake would steady Ayanna on uneven ground, the way she would prepare tea for him after long days, the shared laughter that echoed across the canyon walls. One evening, as the sun painted the desert in shades of red and gold, Ayanna turned to Jake. "Do you ever regret the life you lived before I came?" Jake considered carefully, watching the shadows stretch across the canyon floor. "No," he said finally. "Because if I hadn't lived it, I wouldn't have found you." Ayanna's eyes glimmered, and she leaned into him, resting her head on his shoulder. "Then maybe the desert isn't as cruel as it seems," she murmured. Jake smiled faintly, feeling the weight of years and loss lift slightly. "Maybe not," he agreed, gazing at the horizon where the first stars began to twinkle. As summer waned, the desert offered both challenges and solace. Fires, storms, and the ever-present threat of pursuers tested their skills and endurance. But with each trial, Jake and Ayanna grew stronger together, their trust unshakable, their bond deep and unspoken. They learned to read the desert as one, the way the wind whispered through canyons, the scent of rain on hot earth, the subtle signs of approaching animals, or men. Every day was a lesson, every challenge a testament to their resilience. And in the quiet moments, on the porch at sunset, under a sky blanketed with stars, or beside a trickling spring, they found peace, love, and a life reclaimed from the harshness of the world. The desert had become both sanctuary and battlefield. Jake and Ayanna knew every ridge, every hidden hollow, and every narrow passage that could serve as either cover or trap. Yet even with such knowledge, the constant presence of those seeking Ayanna's capture loomed over them like an unshakable shadow. One morning, Jake noticed smoke rising far off in the eastern canyons. He frowned, studying it with narrowed eyes. "Campfires," he muttered. "They've split into two groups. One's scouting from the ridge. The other is likely near the creek where we water the horses." Ayanna, now confident on her healed ankle, moved beside him, her dark eyes sharp and calculating. "Then we set them up," she said, her voice low, carrying both determination and a hint of excitement. For the next few hours, they prepared. Jake created decoy tracks leading away from their cabin, scattered brush in a way that would mislead anyone following, and positioned small alarms, strings of tin and rocks that would alert them to approaching footsteps. Ayanna collected sage, sand, and small stones, ready to use the environment as both shield and weapon. By mid-afternoon, the first group of pursuers appeared, cautiously advancing along a narrow ridge. Jake and Ayanna lay in wait, their bodies pressed against sun-warmed rock, rifles ready. The first scout stumbled over a hidden tripwire, a tin clattering loudly. He froze, startled, and Jake fired a warning shot over his shoulder. The sharp crack echoed through the canyon, and the man ducked instinctively. The rest of the riders followed, slower now, scanning the terrain. But the traps Jake and Ayanna had prepared were effective. Another rider nearly lost his balance over a cleverly concealed pit, and a small cloud of sand and dirt sent the remaining few scrambling for cover. From a hidden vantage point, Ayanna hurled a handful of sand toward one of the men's eyes, momentarily blinding him. Jake shifted, taking careful aim and forcing the group into disarray. The tactics weren't lethal, they didn't need to be, but they were effective, and the riders quickly realized they were outmatched in this terrain. Meanwhile, the second group moved near the creek. Jake and Ayanna circled quietly, positioning themselves on high ground. From above, they could see the men's movements, hear their whispered curses as they struggled with the terrain. With precise timing, Jake sent rocks tumbling down a narrow chute, forcing the riders to retreat into less favorable positions. Ayanna, moving silently, prepared additional obstacles using brush and fallen branches. Hours passed in tense calculation. The men regrouped, frustration evident in their posture. Jake and Ayanna remained hidden, silent, unyielding. By dusk, the pursuers had had enough. They mounted their horses and retreated, dust and dirt trailing behind like a storm that had broken and dissipated. Jake exhaled, lowering his rifle. Ayanna emerged from her hiding spot, hair wild from the wind, eyes alight with quiet triumph. "We did it," she whispered. "Yes," Jake said, voice rough, a mixture of exhaustion and pride. "We survived again." The night was calm, the desert cooling quickly, a vast expanse of stars overhead. They sat together near a small fire, sharing the warmth and quiet. Jake reached for her hand, fingers brushing lightly. Ayanna met his gaze, dark eyes shining in the firelight, and leaned into him. "You know," she said softly, "I never imagined I could feel safe, or happy, again." "You're safe," Jake replied, voice low. "And I'll make sure of it." She smiled faintly, resting her head against his shoulder. "Then maybe the desert isn't as cruel as I thought." Jake's lips curved into a small smile. "Maybe not," he agreed. The following days were spent tending to the ranch and exploring nearby hidden landmarks. They discovered a secluded spring fed by an underground source, a small grove of trees offering shade and game, and even an abandoned prospector's cabin, perfect for emergencies. Each discovery strengthened their confidence, their sense of mastery over the desert, and their bond with each other. One morning, they rode to the northern ridge to scout for signs of the pursuers. Jake noticed fresh tracks near a dry creek. "They're back," he said quietly, voice tense but controlled. Ayanna's eyes narrowed. "Then we set the trap again. But this time, we finish it." For hours, they prepared, creating an intricate network of obstacles, alarms, and misleading tracks. They positioned themselves strategically, using every natural feature to their advantage. The desert became their ally, every ridge, rock, and crevice a weapon. By late afternoon, the men arrived, moving cautiously. Jake and Ayanna remained hidden, watching their movements. The traps worked perfectly, horses stumbled, men fell, and confusion reigned. Rocks tumbled from above, sand blinded eyes, and strategically timed shots forced the group into disarray. Finally, the scarred man, furious and desperate, emerged from the rear of the group. "Enough," he shouted. "Come down, girl. You can't hide forever." Ayanna stepped forward, dark hair whipping in the wind, eyes blazing. "I will not go," she declared. Jake moved beside her, rifle ready. "Leave now, or face the consequences," he growled. The tension was unbearable, the desert silent except for the distant call of a coyote and the rustle of wind through rocks. The scarred man assessed the situation, realizing that persistence would only lead to failure. With a final curse, he signaled his men to retreat. Dust trailed behind them, fading into the distance like a storm passing. Jake lowered his rifle slowly, exhaling a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Ayanna stepped close, her hand finding his. "We did it," she whispered, voice soft but full of triumph. "Yes," he agreed, holding her hand firmly. "We survived." The following weeks brought a fragile peace. They focused on daily life, repairing fences, tending horses, planting herbs and small crops, and exploring the desert. The harsh environment demanded vigilance, but it also offered moments of quiet beauty and intimacy. One evening, as they sat on the porch, watching the sun dip behind the canyon ridges, Ayanna leaned against Jake. "Do you ever regret the life you had before me?" she asked softly. Jake considered, eyes on the horizon. "No," he said finally. "Because if I hadn't lived it, I wouldn't have found you." Ayanna smiled faintly, eyes glimmering in the fading light. "Then maybe the desert isn't as cruel as it seems," she murmured. Jake's hand brushed her hair gently. "Maybe not," he said. Over time, their reputation grew. Tales of the cowboy and the Apache woman spread quietly through the town and surrounding settlements. Some feared them, some admired them, but none dared interfere. Jake and Ayanna had carved a life of autonomy, safety, and growing love in the midst of the unforgiving desert. Their love was quiet, unspoken but ever-present, in shared glances, in hands held while riding through narrow canyons, in the way they relied on each other in moments of danger. They had survived countless threats, harsh weather, and the relentless desert, yet found strength, trust, and connection in each other. As the summer drew to a close, the desert cooled, stars appearing earlier each night. They sat on the porch one evening, drinking tea made from wild herbs, hands entwined, hearts full of unspoken promise. "I never thought I'd feel this," Ayanna whispered, dark eyes shining. "Neither did I," Jake replied, brushing his lips against her forehead. "But we did. And we will." The desert stretched endlessly around them, harsh yet beautiful, a silent witness to their survival, love, and the life they had reclaimed together. The desert had shifted in color and mood as August waned into early September. The days grew slightly cooler, the sun less oppressive, but the wind still carried the scent of dust and sage. Jake and Ayanna had settled into a pattern that was more than survival, it was life, rich with small routines and quiet intimacy. Morning began with the sound of horses shifting in the corral. Jake rose before dawn, as always, checking fences and ensuring the livestock had water. Ayanna followed shortly after, preparing breakfast over the small cast-iron stove, the aroma of coffee and cornbread filling the cabin. Her ankle had healed completely, though she still moved with a quiet caution, a rhythm of respect for her own strength. "You're up early," she said one morning, carrying a small pot of coffee to the porch. "Some things don't wait," Jake replied, taking the cup with a grunt of thanks. "Fences, cattle, desert, they don't care about sunrise or sunset." Ayanna smiled faintly, sitting beside him. "Neither do I. But I like these mornings with you." Jake's gaze softened. "I like them too." He studied her face, the dark eyes alert and intelligent, the tangle of black hair catching the first light, the strength in her posture despite her quiet demeanor. There was something in her presence that had healed a part of him he hadn't known was still raw. By midday, they were back on the land, checking traps they had set along less traveled ridges and paths. The desert was generous in its lessons. One day, they spotted a coyote caught in a trap set for intruders, a grim reminder that life in the desert required careful attention. They freed it with measured care, and Ayanna whispered to it softly, a gentle sound amidst the harsh environment. Jake watched, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Even the desert animals trust you," he said quietly. "Maybe," she replied, eyes scanning the horizon. Or maybe I just understand fear. The afternoons often found them in town, gathering supplies or selling herbs and handcrafted remedies. The townsfolk had grown accustomed to seeing the pair together, though whispers persisted. Some admired Jake's steadfast nature and Ayana's quiet resilience, others eyed them with suspicion. One day, while at the general store, a group of local ranchers lingered near the doorway, watching them closely. "Callahan," one muttered, voice low and grudging. "Heard about that Apache girl of yours. You sure you're not courting trouble?" Jake set down a sack of flour and looked at the man directly, his jaw tight. "She's not trouble. She's human. And she's under my protection. That's all you need to know." The man grunted, clearly unwilling to argue further, and turned away. Ayana, standing beside Jake, offered him a brief smile, the sort that said they were partners in more than just survival. Jake's heart warmed subtly. The town could whisper, but it couldn't touch what they had built. Back at the ranch, evenings were quiet and intimate. They sat on the porch together, drinking tea brewed from desert herbs, the sun bleeding into the horizon. Jake often found his hand brushing against hers, fingers intertwining naturally. Ayana never pulled away. Instead, she leaned into him, resting her head lightly on his shoulder. "Do you ever think about the life we could have?" she asked one evening, voice soft. Jake considered, eyes on the distant ridges. "I do. But right now, this life, ours, is enough. We survived the worst the desert and men could throw at us. Everything else is bonus." She smiled faintly, dark eyes catching the last of the sun's light. "Then let's make the most of it." The bond between them deepened further when a sudden desert storm struck one afternoon. Thunder rolled across the canyons, lightning cracking the sky in brilliant streaks. The wind picked up with a violent intensity, driving dust and debris through the open land. Jake and Ayana rushed to secure the horses and reinforce the cabin, working seamlessly together. "Hold that beam steady," Jake shouted over the roar of the wind. "I've got it," Ayana replied, her voice steady, calm despite the chaos. By evening, the storm had passed, leaving the desert washed clean, the air fragrant with rain-soaked earth. They sat together by a small fire, dripping wet but safe, the shared ordeal further cementing their trust and reliance. In the following weeks, they explored deeper into the canyon, discovering hidden springs and ancient rock formations. Jake taught Ayana the nuances of navigating the desert, how to read animal tracks, anticipate weather shifts, and recognize signs of hidden danger. She, in turn, shared her knowledge of herbs and natural remedies, teaching him how to make healing poultices and teas from the desert flora. One evening, as the sun set in brilliant oranges and reds, Ayana asked, "Do you ever wonder what life would have been like if we hadn't met?" Jake's gaze lingered on the horizon. "I've thought about it," he admitted. "But then I realize it doesn't matter. Because this, us, is what matters now." Her eyes softened, and she leaned closer, resting her head against his chest. Jake wrapped an arm around her, feeling the steady beat of her heart, and in that moment, the desert seemed less harsh, less lonely. It was theirs, a sanctuary forged through danger, trust, and mutual respect. Tensions resurfaced one morning when fresh tracks appeared near the southern ridges. Jake studied them carefully, noting the spacing and depth. "They're back," he murmured. Ayana's dark eyes narrowed. "Then we prepare. We've learned enough from them. Let's make this final." For the next several days, they reinforced defenses, created decoy trails, and strategically positioned themselves throughout the canyon. The desert became both shield and weapon once again. Every ridge, rock, and hollow was accounted for, every movement deliberate and coordinated. When the pursuers finally returned, they found themselves at a disadvantage. Traps were triggered, hidden alarms alerted the pair, and Jake and Ayana's superior knowledge of the land allowed them to dictate every encounter. The scarred man, frustrated and desperate, realized too late that persistence alone would not win the day. In a tense standoff, Ayanna stepped forward, dark hair catching the sunlight, eyes blazing with defiance. "I am not going anywhere," she declared. Jake moved beside her, rifle steady. "Leave now," he growled. "Or face the consequences." The men exchanged uncertain glances, realizing they were outmatched. Slowly, they backed away, mounting their horses, and disappeared over the ridges, dust trailing behind like a fading storm. Jake and Ayanna exhaled, lowering their weapons. The desert returned to its quiet, vast expanse, as if acknowledging their survival. They stood together on the ridge, hands intertwined, hearts steady with the knowledge that the worst had passed. The following days were calm. They focused on strengthening the ranch, exploring hidden corners of the canyon, and deepening their connection. Every task, every shared glance, every small gesture of care reinforced their bond. One evening, as the sky turned deep purple and stars began to twinkle, Ayanna asked softly, "Do you think the world outside this desert could understand us?" Jake considered, then shook his head. "They don't need to. We understand each other. That's enough." She smiled, leaning against him. "Then I'm glad we met. Even if it took danger and the desert to bring us here." Jake's hand brushed her hair, fingers lingering. "I'm glad too. More than I can say." The desert stretched endlessly around them, vast, harsh, and unforgiving, yet it had become a place of life, love, and freedom. Through threats, storms, and hardship, Jake and Ayanna had forged a bond unbreakable, their lives intertwined like the ridges and canyons that surrounded them. As the nights grew cooler and the stars shone brighter, they sat together on the porch, sipping tea, hands intertwined, and hearts at peace. The desert was no longer empty, it was alive with their presence, their survival, and the quiet, unspoken love that had grown between them. The desert had softened under the golden light of late September, the air crisp but still carrying the warmth of summer days. Jake and Ayanna moved through their routine with a sense of quiet confidence. The threats that once loomed over them had vanished, replaced by the steady rhythm of life on the ranch and the occasional curiosity of the townsfolk. Word had spread of the Apache woman who lived safely with the cowboy. Some townsfolk came to offer apologies for past suspicion, others simply nodded with respect as they passed. Jake and Ayanna had learned to navigate these interactions with quiet dignity. They didn't need approval, their lives, their bond, were enough. One afternoon, while repairing a fence together, Jake paused and looked at Ayanna. She had tied her hair back, dust clinging to her tanned skin, eyes bright with focus. "You know," he said softly, "I never thought I'd feel this, content again." Ayanna glanced at him, her lips curving in a gentle smile. "Me neither," she admitted. "But here we are." The evening brought the familiar serenity of the desert. They sat on the porch, sharing tea brewed from the herbs Ayanna had planted behind the cabin. Hands intertwined, they watched the horizon, the canyon ridges glowing in hues of pink and amber. "You've made this place feel like home," Jake said, voice low, almost reverent. "And you've made it feel like safety," Ayanna replied. She leaned into him, resting her head lightly against his shoulder. "I didn't think I'd ever trust anyone again, but with you." Jake's fingers brushed her hair gently. "You never have to doubt again. We'll face whatever comes, together." The desert stretched endlessly before them, still harsh and untamed, yet now alive with their presence. Seasons would change, storms would come and go, and life would continue its unforgiving pace, but they had each other. In the quiet of twilight, Jake and Ayanna sat, side by side, hearts steady and hands entwined. There was no need for words. The land, the sky, and the stars above bore witness to their survival, their love, and the life they had reclaimed. And in that silence, as night settled over the canyon, Jake Callahan finally allowed himself to believe that the future could hold more than loss. It could hold everything he had once thought gone, now returned to him in the form of trust, companionship, and love. The ranch thrived. the desert bloomed. And together, they lived, free from fear, bound to each other and the land that had become their sanctuary.